was a drawing on my refrigerator for 11 years. My grandson made it when he was 4 years old, back when he still lived 10 minutes away, and I could drive over on a Tuesday afternoon just because I felt like it. He drew it in crayon, blue and red, and a color he called sunset orange, that was really just the nub of a broken brown crayon he'd worn down to almost nothing. 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, both smiling. Grandpa and me. He told me when he handed it over. I put it on the refrigerator that same day with a magnet shaped like a pineapple, and there it stayed. 11 years. Through 2 winters where the heat barely worked, through the months after my wife passed, through everything. Last spring, my grandson, who is 15 now and 6 feet tall and nothing like the little boy in that drawing, sent me a voicemail I wasn't supposed to understand. I understood every word, and what he told me started something I am still not entirely sure I have the words to describe. My nephew stood living road, told me the bank was neving road, told me the bank was foreclosing on Robert Kent Lear, which is exactly as unglamorous as it sounds, and also one of the most satisfying things I have ever done with my life. I know where property lines are. I know how to read the land. I know when something has been moved that was not supposed to be moved. That skill, knowing when something is off, is probably the only reason any of this worked out the way it did. My son Darren married young. He was 24, she was 22, and they were in love in the way that 20-somethings are in love, which is to say completely and without any particular wisdom about what comes next. Her name was Sylvie. I liked Sylvie well enough at the beginning. She was sharp, funny, could argue about anything and usually win. Darren adored her. I could see that plainly. What I could not see plainly, at least not at first, was her father. His name is Mercer Voss. He is a man who made a great deal of money in commercial real estate in the late 90s and early 2000s, and has spent the years since believing that this money entitles him to an opinion about everything and the right to act on it. He is the kind of man who buys dinner for a table of 8 and then spends the rest of the evening mentioning that he bought dinner for a table of 8. I am not a man who dislikes many people. I have worked outdoors my whole life, and I have found that people who work outdoors tend to develop a patience for other people that indoor work does not always cultivate. But Mercer Voss tested that patience from the first Thanksgiving we sat across from each other to the day he made a decision that cost my son 5 years of his boy's life. My grandson is named Eli. Eli was born with a condition called childhood apraxia of speech. It is a neurological disorder that affects the brain's ability to coordinate the muscle movements required for speaking. Eli understood language perfectly. He processed everything. He thought in full sentences, full ideas, full feelings. He just could not make his mouth do what he told it to do. Words came out broken, or not at all, or in ways that strangers could not follow. Darren learned to understand him. I learned to understand him. His teachers at the specialized school in Lexington, where he thrived, and where the staff actually knew what they were doing. They learned to understand him. Eli communicated with a combination of a speech-generating device, written notes, and a particular kind of rapid expressive gesture system that wasn't formal sign language, but was close enough that we all became fluent without really planning to. Sylvie could follow him on good days. On bad days, she handed him the tablet and waited. Mercer Voss couldn't follow him at all, and I believe, though I cannot prove it, that he did not particularly try. The divorce came when Eli was 9. Darren had found out that Sylvie had been moving money, slowly, quietly, small amounts from their joint account into something she had opened in her own name, 18 months before she ever mentioned the word divorce. By the time Darren noticed the pattern, there was $43,000 sitting somewhere he couldn't access. His lawyer called it dissipation of marital assets. The judge called it a complicating factor. Sylvie's lawyer, a man Mercer had paid for, called it a misunderstanding. It was not a misunderstanding. Darren got shared custody in the agreement. 1 week on, 1 week off. Standard arrangement. Eli would stay in Lexington, stay at his school, stay in the life he knew. That was the deal. 8 months later, Sylvie moved to Nashville. She said she had a job opportunity. She said Eli would adjust. She said the schools in Nashville were perfectly adequate and that Darren could still have his weeks. They would just involve driving. When Darren's lawyer filed an emergency motion to stop the relocation, Mercer's money showed up again in the form of a motion to counterclaim, a request for full primary custody, and a deposition that characterized my son as volatile, unreliable, and emotionally unfit. None of it was true. All of it was documented in a way that required my son to spend money he did not have to refute it. The judge in Tennessee did not know Darren, did not know Eli, looked at Darren's income. He managed a hardware distribution warehouse, and looked at Sylvie's income, which was now supplemented substantially by Mercer, and made a decision that I have never once stopped being angry about. Primary custody to Sylvie. Darren got every other weekend, supervised for the first 6 months pending a behavior evaluation that was ultimately inconclusive. Phone calls permitted but not required to be answered. They were not required to be answered. They were not answered, not consistently, not after the first year. Darren drove to Nashville twice to see Eli. The first time, Sylvie's boyfriend, a man named Beckford, who I will get to, met him at the door and told him Eli wasn't feeling well. The second time, nobody answered at all. His lawyer sent letters. Sylvie's lawyer responded with scheduling conflicts and a suggested mediation process that stretched across 14 months and produced nothing. After 2 years, Darren stopped trying as hard as he should have. I am not proud of this fact, and I know he isn't either, but I have seen what that kind of sustained helplessness does to a person. You start to believe the system is telling you something true about yourself. You start to wonder if maybe your presence in your child's life is doing more harm than good, which is exactly what people like Mercer Voss want you to wonder. I kept sending cards to Eli. Every birthday. Every Christmas. Every time I found something that made me think of him. A book about weather systems that I thought he'd like. A National Geographic with a piece on satellite mapping that connected to something he'd mentioned once about wanting to understand how maps were made. I don't know how many of them he received. For 4 years, I heard nothing back. Then, 11 months ago, my phone rang at 6:40 in the morning on a Wednesday. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. The voicemail was 42 seconds long. I played it 3 times before I understood what I was hearing. It was Eli's voice, or what I understood to be Eli's voice, because the speech was fragmented, consonants dropped, syllables compressed. But he had clearly practiced this. You could hear the effort in every word, the concentration, the determination to be understood by someone who had not heard him speak in years. Grandpa, it's Eli. Don't call this number back. I borrowed it. I have to tell you something about the house and the money. Mom doesn't know I know. Beckford showed me something he shouldn't have. I wrote it all down, please. That was it. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I am 63 years old and I have navigated a fair number of difficult situations in my life. But I have never sat with something quite like what I sat with that morning. My grandson, who struggles to speak, who had been essentially unreachable for 4 years, had used his limited window of borrowed time and borrowed phone to leave me 42 seconds about money and a house and something he had been shown and should not have seen. I played it a 5th time. I wrote down every word I could make out. Then I called my son. Darren came over that afternoon. He listened to the voicemail 4 times in a row, and when he took out the earbuds, his face had a look on it that I can only describe as a man being offered something he had almost stopped believing existed. Hope, but the fragile kind. The kind that hurts to feel because you've learned not to. We both knew we needed someone to help us understand what Eli might have seen. The problem was we didn't know exactly what we were dealing with. House and money. That could mean anything. I called a lawyer friend I'd known since my surveying days, a woman named Patricia Okafor, who handles estate work out of Lexington, and who has the particular gift of asking exactly the right question without making you feel like an idiot for not having asked it first. She listened to the voicemail. She listened twice. August, she said. That child is describing something specific. The way he says the house and the money together. He's not talking about household expenses. He's talking about a property transaction of some kind. Do you know what property Sylvie's family has been dealing with in the last few years? I did not, but I knew who might. Mercer Voss had a brother, a man named Doyle, who had left the family business 20 years earlier under circumstances nobody talked about, and who had moved to western Tennessee and bought himself about 400 acres of land and a small cattle operation and wanted nothing to do with his brother. I had met Doyle exactly once at a funeral, and he had shaken my hand with the grip of a man who does physical work and said, of Mercer, "That one's going to cause trouble for your family. I'm sorry for it." He'd said it matter-of-factly, like a weather forecast. I found Doyle's number through a former colleague who knew someone who knew the county extension office in his area. I called him on a Thursday evening. He remembered me immediately. "I figured someone from your side would call eventually," he said. "Took longer than I expected. What Doyle told me took about an hour and required me to take 4 pages of notes in the yellow legal pad I keep beside the telephone. Mercer Voss's father had died 3 years earlier. He had left behind a property in central Tennessee, 12 acres with a farmhouse on it, assessed at around $800,000, primarily because of a commercial corridor that had developed along the adjacent highway since the original purchase. The will, as Doyle understood it, had divided the estate among Mercer, Doyle, and a third sibling who had predeceased their father, with that third sibling's share reverting to his children. What Doyle had been told, through a cousin who still talked to people inside the family, was that the property had been sold 18 months ago. Sale price $740,000. Proceeds had been distributed. Doyle had received nothing. He had hired an attorney. His attorney had requested documentation. What came back was a copy of a revised will, dated 14 months before the father's death, in which Doyle's share had been removed and the full estate left to Mercer. "I don't believe that's his signature," Doyle told me. "I knew my father's signature for 60 years. That document has something close to it, but it isn't his." He paused. "And if that boy of yours saw paperwork in that house, there's a reason Beckford would have had it. Beckford's the one who handled the property sale. He's been Mercer's fixer for years." I asked him what he meant by fixer. "The kind of man who makes problems go away," Doyle said, "for a fee. Mercer's been using him since at least 2015. Notary, property manager, occasionally other things. He's not licensed for most of what he does. He just does it." I wrote down Beckford's full name. I wrote down the address of the property. I wrote down the name of the title company that had processed the sale. Then I called Patricia back. What followed was not fast. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect that when you have the right information, things move quickly. They do not. There were 3 weeks of calls, of document requests, of Patricia conferring with a colleague who handled probate litigation, of Doyle flying to Lexington to sign a sworn statement, of my son sitting at my kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night with dark circles under his eyes saying, "Are you sure about this, Dad? Because if we're wrong—" "We're not wrong," I told him. "Your son told us something true. We owe it to him to see it through." Patricia's probate colleague, a man named Sam Whitfield, filed a challenge to the amended will in Tennessee probate court. He also filed a report with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation regarding the potential forgery and contacted the state licensing board about Beckford's activities as an unlicensed notary. That same week, we got a second message from Eli. This time it was a text from another number I didn't recognize. 3 sentences. "They know I talked to someone. Beckford is mad. I need to come home." I read that text and felt something turn over in my chest. Whatever careful, methodical pace we had been keeping, it was over. Darren drove to Nashville that same afternoon, not to confront anyone, just to be close. He parked 2 blocks from Sylvie's house and called Patricia from his car and said, "What can I do right now that won't get me arrested?" Patricia called a colleague in family law. Family law colleague called the Tennessee Department of Children's Services with a concern about a minor in potential distress. DCS made a welfare visit. Ellie told the caseworker that he was scared and that a man in the house had grabbed him by the arm when he found out Eli had been using a neighbor's phone. They documented it. They notated it. They did not remove him that day, which nearly destroyed my son where he sat, but they scheduled a follow-up, and they flagged Beckford's name. When Beckford's name went into the DCS system, it connected to something nobody in our family had known about, a prior report from 2019 in a different county involving a different child that had been investigated and closed, but not expunged. 2 caseworkers talked to each other. A supervisor got involved. The TBI, meanwhile, had started looking at the property transaction. A forensic document examiner reviewed the amended will. Her finding, delivered in a report that I have read so many times I could probably recite it, was that the signature showed evidence of guided hand forgery, a technique where a person with declining motor control is physically assisted in signing a document in a manner that produces a signature appearing to be theirs but reflecting the guide's movement patterns. Eli's grandfather had had Parkinson's disease in the last 2 years of his life. Beckford had been present at the signing. He was the notary of record. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning. Beckford first, at Sylvie's house. The officers came at 7:15, and Darren was parked 4 blocks away because Patricia had called him the night before and said be nearby but stay in your car. He did. He told me later it was the hardest thing he had ever done, sitting in that car, knowing his son was inside that house and that people he did not trust were being taken out of it in handcuffs. Eli came out with a caseworker 20 minutes after the officers arrived. He was wearing a grey sweatshirt and carrying a backpack, and he looked, Darren said, like someone who had been waiting for a long time for something to end. Darren got out of the car. Eli saw him and stopped walking. Then he crossed the distance between them in about 4 seconds, and my son caught him, and they stood there on a sidewalk in Nashville for a long time, not moving. Darren told me he couldn't speak. Ellie, who was always found speaking harder than almost anyone around him, pulled back after a while and looked at his father and said with immense effort and absolute clarity 2 words, "You came." Darren told me he said back, "I was always going to come." He told me that 3 times when he called me, like he needed me to confirm that it was real. It was real. The legal proceedings took the better part of a year. Beckford was charged with forgery, fraud, and unlicensed practice in connection with notarial acts. The DA also filed a charge related to the physical altercation with Eli. Sylvie was charged with fraud as a secondary party, though her attorney argued, with some partial success, that she had not understood the full scope of what Mercer and Beckford had arranged. She accepted a plea agreement. 18 months probation. Restitution. Mercer Voss was charged with will forgery, fraud, and conspiracy. He hired lawyers from 3 firms. His trial lasted 11 days. The jury deliberated for less than a day. 12 years. Doyle received his share of the estate, plus damages, through the civil settlement that followed. He called me when the wire transfer cleared. "That boy of yours saved my inheritance," he said. "Tell him I said so." I told Eli exactly that. Eli lives with Darren now. They're in Lexington, in a house my son bought in November. A 3-bedroom place in a neighborhood with good schools and a yard big enough that Eli has started talking about getting a dog, which I have been firmly told is not yet a settled question. He's in a school he likes. He has a speech therapist he's worked with for 2 years now, who he described to me in the particular way Eli describes things he values, as the first one who listened to how I talk instead of trying to change it. He has 2 friends he games with on weekends and a history teacher he thinks is actually funny, which I understand is high praise from a 15-year-old. The adjustment wasn't seamless. 5 years of distance doesn't just dissolve because the circumstances change. There were weeks in the beginning when Eli was quiet in a way that wasn't his usual quiet, a tighter kind, a watchful kind. He startled at loud voices. He checked the locks before bed, but slowly, week by week, the watchfulness loosened. Slowly, the house started to feel like a house and not a place he was waiting to be taken from. I see him on Sundays. We established that ritual almost immediately, because I have learned at 63 that rituals are what hold the shape of things when the shape wants to blur. I pick him up at 10 in the morning and we go to a diner in town that has been open since 1974 and makes a biscuit so large it covers most of the plate, and we sit across from each other and talk. Or I talk, and Eli types or gestures or writes on the notepad he keeps in his jacket pocket, and I listen. He told me once, about 3 months after he moved back, what it had been like in that house. He typed it out on his tablet because some things are easier to communicate when you don't have to say them out loud. He said that for most of the time he'd lived there, he had felt like he was invisible. Not because people didn't see him, but because they looked at him and assumed that what they saw was all there was. A kid who couldn't talk right. A kid who needed managing. A kid who would not understand complex things, would not remember details, would not know the significance of what he was overhearing in the next room. He said, "They forgot I could read. I read everything." He said Beckford had left the document on the kitchen table one evening while he was on a phone call in the backyard, a folder with the property address on the tab, the sale closing summary, a handwritten note in Beckford's writing that referenced the amended will by date and amount. Eli had taken a photograph of the tablet he'd borrowed from a classmate. Then he'd written down what he'd seen in a notebook he kept under his mattress, in the same shorthand he'd developed years ago to communicate quickly when his device wasn't charged. He had held on to that information for 4 months before he found a way to reach me. 4 months. 15 years old, living in a house with a man he was afraid of, carrying knowledge that he had no way to know would be believed, and he held on to it, organized it, waited for a moment when he could act. I asked him how he knew to call me. Why me and not someone else? He thought about it for a while before he typed his answer. "You always answered the door when I knocked, even when I couldn't say what I needed. You just opened the door." I have not figured out how to respond to that. I'm not sure you're supposed to. The drawing is still on my refrigerator. It has been there for 11 years now. The paper has gone soft and slightly yellowed at the edges, and one corner came loose from the pineapple magnet sometime in the last winter, and I reattached it with a second magnet. So now there are 2 magnets holding it up instead of one. The figures are the same. One tall, one small, both smiling with the unself-conscious confidence of crayon. I look at it differently now. I spent a long time thinking of that drawing as a picture of what I had. What our family was before everything split apart. I kept it on the refrigerator for 11 years, because I could not stand the idea of putting it away, of admitting that the thing it depicted was over and done. But it wasn't a picture of the past. It was a picture of something that held. Ely came over last Sunday and saw me looking at it while the coffee brewed. He stood next to me and studied it for a moment the way he does when he's deciding whether to say something. Then he reached up and straightened it very slightly, just a nudge so the taller figure was more upright, and he nodded once with a satisfaction that was entirely his own and went to sit at the kitchen table. I poured the coffee. I sat across from him. Some things don't have to be said out loud. If you have a child or grandchild in your life who communicates differently than the world expects, please listen to how they communicate, not just whether they can do it the way you're used to. Eli had something important to say for a long time. He said it the way he was able to say it. The rest of us just had to stop waiting for it to come out the right way and start paying attention to what was actually being said. Drop your story in the comments. I read every one. If something in here felt true to you, hit like. It's a small thing that helps more than you'd think. And if you want more stories from this channel, subscribe and hit that bell, because we put something new up every week. Share it if someone in your life needs to hear it. Because sometimes the people who have the hardest time being heard are the ones who have the most important things to say. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one. I've had a lot of time to think about how all of this happened, not just the legal pieces. Those I can trace clearly enough, one decision leading to the next, the way water finds a downhill path. I mean the deeper mechanics of it, why it ended the way it did and not some other way. And what I keep coming back to is this. The people who tried to use Eli's limitations as cover for what they were doing made one assumption that was never true. They assumed that because he struggled to speak, he struggled to understand. They decorated that assumption with impatience, with condescension, with a particular laziness of people who have never had to work hard to be heard, and so cannot imagine anyone else doing it either. Mercer left documents on a kitchen table. Beckford made phone calls in the next room. They talked about money and property and things that should have been private. And they did it in front of a 15-year-old boy because they had already decided he wasn't really listening. He was listening. He was reading. He was writing things down in a notebook under his mattress and waiting for a moment to act. That is not luck. That is character, and character does not arrive from nowhere. It is built slowly out of the choices a person makes about what to pay attention to and what to hold on to when holding on is hard. Eli held on. For 4 years he held on to the language he and his father had built together. He held on to the memory of a grandfather who had always opened the door. He held on to the idea that what he knew mattered, even when the world around him was organized to suggest otherwise. I think about my son Darren in those years too. The ones where he pulled back. I understood it at the time, and I understand it better now. There is a particular kind of damage that comes from fighting a system that has decided you are the problem, and that damage looks a lot like giving up even when it isn't. But Darren drove to Nashville the same afternoon I called him. He parked 2 blocks from a house he had no legal right to approach, and he waited, because that was what he could do, and he did it fully. That is what I mean by ethics being something you practice, rather than something you declare. Neither of us did everything right across those years, but when the moment came that required showing up completely, we showed up. And Eli had read us accurately enough across years of distance and silence to know that we would. Mercer Voss is in federal prison now. Beckford is awaiting sentencing. Sylvie is living with the consequences of choices she told herself were small enough to ignore. The cause of all of it was simple. They chose repeatedly to treat people as less than they were. A grandson who couldn't speak easily. A son without the money to fight back. A brother who had walked away. They built their scheme on the assumption that the people they were harming wouldn't be able to explain what had been done to them. They were wrong about all 3 of us. I think that is the thing worth carrying out of this story. Not that things worked out. They nearly didn't, and for years they didn't at all. But that the intelligence and decency and stubborn refusal to disappear that Eli demonstrated were never separate from the love he'd been given before any of this started. You cannot pour that into a child and then act surprised when it holds. The drawing is still on my refrigerator. It held, too,